Welcome to the Nightclub, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. Now, as you guys might know or might not know, I'm part of about 3 or 4 different Facebook groups, all of them dealing with either carburetors, whether they're Holley Carburetors, carbureted LSs, carburetors in general. I'm just a part of a myriad of different Facebook groups. And lately, I've been seeing a lot of questions since a lot of people are, it's getting closer to the spring, snow starting to melt. People want to drive their cars, they want to tune up their vehicles, and they have no idea where to start, so they start posting questions online, asking what kind of jets they should run, if the carburetor is too big or too small for an application, etc., etc. And I'm not necessarily upset or angry at the types of questions being asked, because when somebody doesn't know something, it's very important that they ask questions. But the issue actually lies in the fact that people just honestly don't know how jetting works, or jetting of a carburetor in particular works, and the answers given to the questions being asked are sometimes just so far out there they have no idea what they're talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zone in right here. I'm going to specify what jetting is, what it actually means, how it works, and how to jet your carburetor properly for your given application. So as most of you guys know, jets are these little brass plugs that you install in the metering block of your carburetor. If it's a standard Holley 4150, 4160, if it's the Autolite style carbs where it's like sandwiched, the jets are actually placed at the very bottom of the fuel bowls. We're going to focus specifically on the 4150, 4160 style of carburetors. So the main jets actually live right here on the metering block. If we are going to go ahead and locate them on the carburetor, this is the fuel bowl, this is the metering block. The metering block sits right here. This back part faces the main body, and you've got your idle screws right here. Your fuel bowl sits here. You've got your fuel level dictated by your float right here, and then the fuel actually sits right here. So the main jets actually sit below your fuel line. So if you guys are paying attention right here, if your fuel level is actually sitting right here, your jets are actually sitting right here. So they're always submerged under fuel. So they're submerged under fuel inside the fuel bowl. And typically on a gasoline engine, you're going to have this type of jet. If you're talking about an alcohol or E85 carburetor, you're going to be running these significantly larger jets, which you can get up into the 140s, 160s, 180s. These in particular are 180s. And as you can see, the orifice is a lot bigger, but it also won't screw into a gasoline because the thread size is one size bigger. So they're not interchangeable. What the jets actually do, they're actually a restriction to prevent more fuel than you need from going from the fuel bowl through the metering block. And this restriction, what it does, it has this little orifice right here, just like I showed you with the E85 alcohol carburetor. This one in particular is a 70, which is a very common, 6970 are very, very common sizes. And you can see how small it is compared to the 180 that is this big. Some people think that the size numbers are in relation to the actual size of the hole, and although it might be true for the smaller sizes, according to the Holley books themselves, after you get past like 70, 75, it starts varying a little bit, and the hole sizes don't necessarily line up to the jet numbers. So you got to be careful which numbers you end up following. You want to go ahead and measure your jets whenever you're installing them, because different jets from different manufacturers will measure differently and thus give you different readings inside of your carburetor. It's not going to run perfect if you have 2 different jets from 2 different years, 2 different manufacturers. You want to make sure you have matching pairs and run them in your engine. So ignoring the alcohol carburetor and sticking just to gasoline, like I mentioned before, they offer a restriction to prevent excessive fuel from entering the body of the carburetor. So what will happen is, if you take these jets out, you have whatever size jet the actual hole of the jet is, that's going to be your main jet, and you can't get any more fuel than whatever this maximum hole is. If you go ahead and pull these out, stick them on your carburetor, and try to start your engine, it's going to run. It'll run super, super, super rich and get even richer as you increase RPM. But for the most part, you're going to want to run whatever size jet you need for your application. Now, when you talk about off-the-shelf carburetors, they have jetting such as like 60 65, 68, 66, 66, 69, 72, 72, 80. So what that means is a relation between the front and the back jets, which, let me remind you guys, are tuned independently. Whatever you tune on the primaries might affect the secondary air fuel, but whatever you tune in the secondaries will not affect your primary air fuel. So you want to make sure you go ahead and tune your transition circuit, your main jet circuit, your idle circuit way before you go into the secondaries, because it all compounds. You think of it as a triangle: main jets, idle jets, IFRs, power valve, they're all on the bottom of the triangle, and the secondaries are on the top. You want to make sure you tune your secondaries last. So 2 questions. Number 1, what dictates the size of the carburetor? And number 2, what dictates your jetting? You guys can go on websites like Summit Racing and a couple other websites that have carburetor calculators. What it does is it takes your current engine, the horsepower, the displacement, what RPM you're going to rev it to, and then judging by that assessment, it gives you an estimated carburetor size. So most engines, like let's say my 5.3 LS, I think it requires like a 525 or a 550 carburetor. If you take like a 350 with like a basic cam and you're only revving it to 5500, then it's probably also going to only need a 550 CFM. What does that actually mean? So a carburetor is measured by the bores inside of the main body. So there's 2 parts to a Holley carburetor. You've got your whatever's in your base plate, your throttle bores. You have this size, and then you have the size of the Venturis, which is these holes around the boosters. Now the holes up here are not the same size as the holes on the bottom. They're kind of like at a taper. So the smaller carburetors, such like a 600, 575, will tend to have a smaller Venturi. Carburetors like a 650, 670 will tend to have a larger Venturi. Carburetors like a 575, 600 will tend to have a smaller throttle bore compared to a 650. And then a 650 to a 670 will tend to have a smaller Venturi. Manufacturers play with different sizes of throttle bore and base plates, so when you see a carburetor that's designated as a 650, it might not flow the same CFM as a different manufacturer also advertising a 650. It's become more of a marketing term than anything else. So in reality, when you install any given carburetor on your application, you've got to actually dial in the air-fuel ratio, which actually dictates how the engine's going to run. If you run a 750, you have to adjust the jetting as such. If you run a 650, you have to adjust the setting as such. So most off-the-shelf carburetors don't just run perfectly out of the box. You guys got to remember that when carburetors are tuned from the factory, they are designed to work well on a specific test engine, and then from there they have a list of parameters that you can vary from slightly, and it's still going to run well. Depending on the engine that it's tuned on, it will determine if it's going to run well on your particular application, which is why some people say that specific brawler combinations don't work versus a standard Holley one of the same CFM does. And it's not just because they're different manufacturers, it's because the carburetors were designed a specific way. Take, for example, the Street Avenger from Holley and the Truck Avenger from Holley. Let's take 2 650, 670 carburetors. Because they're designed for different applications or different power levels, different jetting, different IFRs, and etc., air bleeds are all going to be tuned specifically for whatever test engine they decided to tune with. So what does that specifically have to do with jetting, and how can you actually tune your carburetor? So ignoring the size of the carburetor for a second, there was a post on the carburetor group. So the question being asked is, how do you detune a 750 carburetor? So there's one constant and a couple different variables for a Holley carburetor. The constant is airflow, how much air the engine is breathing in, and how high of the RPM does it breathe in. Okay, so let's put this information into perspective. Let's say this is an imaginary dyno graph. The bottom line is your RPM, your top line is horsepower. Just like you guys always see on the Richard Holdner's channel, let's say the test engine is just a standard stock small block Chevy. The size of the engine for this particular part of the video doesn't really matter. So let's say it's a stock engine. Let's say the power curve looks like this, right? We're just looking at horsepower right now. So let's say this is the horsepower curve. Let's say we go ahead and put like a stage 2 cam, stage 3 cam, and now the power curve looks like this, right? So let's say this is, I don't know, 200 horsepower. And let's say this is 300 horsepower. So given that both of these tests are run on the same 350 small block Chevy, you would assume that the 300 horsepower engine is going to require a bigger carburetor than a 200 horsepower engine, right? And the reason for that is because the higher in horsepower you have at a higher RPM, it's basically the result of more air being sucked in. So in layman's terms, more air equals more power. So if you guys notice here on the bottom, usually when you go into a more radical camshaft, you end up losing a little power down low. Usually it's pretty negligible, but on the torque curves, if we had those on this line, you could almost always tell that you're losing a ton of torque the bigger in cam that you go to. But we're not actually talking about torque right now, we're only talking about horsepower. So let's say for this application, we're running a 650 vacuum secondary. It doesn't matter if it's a vacuum secondary or a 650 double pumper, because on a dyno we're running full throttle, so it doesn't matter either way, because throughout the entire test we're running at full throttle, and the secondaries are going to be open for both applications, or at least they should be. So let's assume for the 200 horsepower run, we're running 68s in the primaries and 65 in the secondaries, and that gives us a pretty close to 13-to-1 on the air-fuel ratio throughout the entire run, which is pretty common and pretty standard. Sometimes people like it a little bit richer, like 12.5, but it doesn't really matter for this test. After we installed the cam, we're looking at the 300 horsepower run, and your jetting changed to 70-70. So for you guys watching, you guys can tell that on the first run, you were running 68, and then you're running 65 on the secondaries. Why is the secondary number lower than the primary? Now with the jetting changed for the 300 horsepower mark, why are they now the same? So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the main body so you guys can understand something. So like I mentioned earlier, the main body is divided really into two parts where air travels through. One is the Venturis, and the other one is the base plate with the throttle bores. So for the throttle bores, the holes right here that you're looking at right here, the bigger they are, the more air you're flowing at any given part of your RPM. So when they're closed, they're only this open. When they're at part throttle, they're this open. But when you compare something like this to, let's say, a 600, this is a 650, and you compare this to a 600, the same amount that's open on the 600 is going to be less than the amount that you're open on the 650. And that's because the hole is bigger, you have more area around the throttle bore, which allows more air to travel through. Now, the hole on top, the Venturi, is basically the choke point for the air. So if the bottom is a response, the top is going to be the maximum amount of airflow. The bottom really can't flow any less than the top because the top is smaller. So when you go ahead and increase the size of this, like going up to a 750, 850, 950, etc., this Venturi gets bigger. When the Venturi gets bigger, you allow more air to go through the carburetor. Because you allow more air to the carburetor, the speed of the air going through the carburetor actually slows down. Think of a water hose. When you have a water hose and you just open it, water just kind of flows out. When you put your thumb on it, water increases in pressure and shoots out at a much faster and stronger pace. Same thing goes with the carburetor. When the air is being forced through the hole, the pressure inside of the Venturi is higher than it would be if the airflow was going through a larger Venturi. So what happens is when you have a smaller Venturi, you have higher pressures going through the booster, which allows for better fuel atomization and more response at lower RPMs. At full throttle, it doesn't tend to affect as much, and that's where you tend to see the horsepower differences. But when you're looking at low RPM performance, the Venturis have more to do than the actual throttle bores. So what does that actually have to do with jetting? So I mentioned that these Venturis dictate the choke point or the maximum airflow that it can run. So you're going to notice that on a Holley square bore, the front and the back are basically the same size. So if you're flowing, like I mentioned before, 68 jets in the front, why aren't you flowing the same amount in the back? I mean, they're both the same size, right? When you floor it, they should be both pulling the same amount of air, especially if it's a double pumper. They should be both flowing the same amount of air. Why is it that we have different jet sizes on the front and the back versus having them on the same on all four corners? And there's a couple different answers to that. The first one is in a racing application where you are just worried about racing. Two things are true. You don't run a vacuum secondary, and you try to run as square jets as you can. So if you run 65s in the front, you run 65s in the back. If you run 68s in the front, you run 68s in the back. And the reason for that is you want your fuel to be distributed through your intake manifold as evenly as you can, so you produce almost identical air fuel ratios on all cylinders. So when you translate that to a street car, what will happen is your street car will probably require 68, 65, 68 in the primary, 65 in the secondaries, because your cam doesn't flow as much in the secondaries as it does in the primaries. But what do you mean? The RPM is higher, you're going to be sucking in more air. Yes, but are you sucking in more air than your carburetor can actually handle? Or is your engine not sucking up enough air? So we go back to the dyno chart that I mentioned earlier. On a lot of stock applications, you won't need to increase the secondary size in relation to the primary. If this was a racing application, you'd probably see 66, 66, or 67, 67. What happens is when you are tuning for a street application, you are tuning the primaries first. Whatever gets your primaries to run in clean, crisp condition. Like I mentioned before, you tune your idles and your transition first, then you move into your main jets, then you move into your power valve. So when you finish doing your idle and your transition, it's time to tune your main jets. You're going to tune for the airflow that you want. You can't really tune for vacuum because you're actually driving, so you want to tune for AFR. People doing this on the street, it's actually pretty simple. You put a fresh spark plug in whatever cylinder is easy to look at. You start driving, you make sure you're in your main jets and not in the transition, and then you turn off your car, pull over, and then you check your plugs. And then you can go up or down depending on what exactly you need. If it's too rich, you want to jet down. If it's too lean, you want to jet up. But when you tune your primaries on a stock cam or stock application where the higher RPMs aren't really touched as much and they're not really focused on in the eyes of the manufacturer, you're going to notice that you're going to end up needing more fuel in the primaries than you will in the secondaries, because your engine is not flowing enough air in the secondaries to require the added fuel. So the difference between a street tune and a race tune in this aspect is that when you're driving on the street, you're mainly driving on the primary, so that's where most of your fuel is going to end up. When you go into the secondaries, you're taking your primaries, then you're adding fuel from your power valve, and then whatever is left over that you need, your secondaries are going to provide. So the more fuel you need in the secondaries, the higher you're going to need to run your jets. So the next question is this: why is it that when you install a cam, you need to increase the secondaries by a lot, but the primaries by not that much? And as you guys can see right here, like I mentioned before, when you guys switch over to a heavier duty cam, a higher lift cam with more duration, you're going to be producing a lot more power on the top end, but you end up losing torque and you end up losing stability in the low RPMs. What that translates to in terms of jetting, although you are flowing more air at the lower RPMs, velocity tends to be a little bit slower, engines tend to run a little bit more sloppy, but you still need that added amount of fuel because you're still running more air. You're just not running that much more air because the airflow is actually slower, but you still need to jet up. But on the secondaries, now you're running considerably more amount of air because now you're at full throttle, your cam is taking advantage of more air, so now you're going to need significantly more jetting to offset the primaries. So why is it that on this run we're running 70-70 and on this one we're running 68-65? Why are these square and why is the primaries bigger on the lower horsepower run? And that all comes down to airflow of the camshaft. An engine will only suck in as much air as it needs. I seem to reiterate this fact a lot throughout my live streams because people don't seem to quite get it. An engine will only suck in as much air as it needs. So it doesn't matter if it's a 600, a 650, a 750, 850, 950, etc. If you jet it correctly, even at full throttle, even with your throttles completely open, a 650, if it's too big for your engine, will flow the same amount of air as a 950, which is probably too big for your engine. So what that means is, if I flip this carburetor back upside down and we're running a full throttle pass, your engine is on a stock cam. Your engine is fully utilizing the primaries, but it's only utilizing a little bit of the secondaries because that's all it's able to suck in. When you swap in a bigger camshaft, you're going to be able to utilize the secondaries a lot more because now you're using up a lot more air in the higher RPMs, right? So if an engine will only suck in as much air as it needs, why is it that a 750 carburetor tends to run rich on my engine and a 650 tends to run like normal? Why is my engine running more rich with the bigger carburetor? Is it true that when you put a bigger carburetor, you tend to run a lot more fuel in your engine? And that is both true and false, and I'm going to explain why. So when you have a 650 that's tuned for your engine, let's say you already had it perfectly tuned or you paid somebody to tune it and it's tuned specifically for your engine, right? Then you take a 750 and you remove your carburetor that ran good and you throw in a 750. Now, not only do you have to start in from scratch because your carburetor is designed for a very specific engine it's supposed to go on, and if your engine doesn't match up fairly close to what the old engine is, your air-fuel ratio is going to be off. But not only that, when you go to a bigger carburetor, your IFRs tend to be bigger, your air bleeds tend to be bigger, your jetting tends to be higher. So when somebody talks about detuning, it's taking that 750 and then tuning it to a lower power level than you actually need. Why would you want to do that? Because that's what you have available and you're thinking that you can get an extra 5, 10, 15 horsepower at putting a slightly bigger carburetor on it, when in reality you're probably fine with the 650 carburetor. 650s are probably good up to, I want to say, 350, 400 horsepower, no problem. 750s are a little bit beyond that. So when you detune a carburetor like a 750 and you tune it down to fit on your smaller engine that doesn't require that much air, what you got to do is you want to go ahead and compensate that by taking away fuel because your engine is not sucking in as much air as it was designed to do. So the first thing people end up doing is they start jetting down. So when you jet down, you're getting that your main circuit and your secondary circuit down to a manageable level. But that's not where it ends. Your tuning doesn't end just by swapping out your main jets. It also has a lot to do with your idle circuit, your accelerator pump circuit, your transition circuit, which are arguably the most important circuit in your carburetor is going to be the transition circuit. And from what I've seen, 750 carburetors run bigger AFRs than a 650. So here's another thing you guys got to consider. Jetting an IFR, if you are comparing a 650 and a 750, they're not going to respond the same. Like I mentioned earlier, a 750 has a bigger Venturi, 650 has a smaller Venturi. So the way air responds and flows through the carburetor is going to be different. Because a 750 flows more air than 650, you're going to get more air everywhere. The physical size of the Venturis and the throttle blades do not change based on RPM. Those are constant. The amount of air going through your engine is a constant. The amount of fuel that's going through your carburetor, that's what changes. So if you compare, let's say, a 65 jet on a 650, you're not going to be able to run that same 65 on the 750 because even though your engine is the same, because you switch over to a bigger carburetor, you're going to need to compensate the amount of fuel. But that doesn't only count towards larger CFM carburetors. If you take a 650 like this one and a 650 standard Holley, this is going to require more jetting than the standard Holley will. And that's because you can allow more air to flow through the carburetor easier than you can with the standard 650, because the standard 650 has a choke horn. The standard 650 doesn't have radius entries. So even though they're both rated at 650 CFM, This one's going to require more jetting because at any given throttle position, this is going to flow more air easier than the standard 650 wheel, which is why a lot of people switch over to the HP main bodies. It's because airflow travels through here easier. If airflow travels through the carburetor easier, that means you're getting more air per stroke. That means you're making more power. So two different 650s can make two different power levels just because the entry of the carburetor is different. So CFM is only one part of the equation. But just like this 650 and another 650 would be different, if you compare this 650 to a 750, the jetting is going to be different, and chances are 750 with an HP main body and a 650 with an HP main body just like this one, the 750 is going to require more jetting. But how do you know how much? Really? So when you start off with the 650 and it's running perfectly fine, and you go in and you install a 750, you're gonna want to start off with the jetting from the 650. So if your original jetting was 68, 65, and you're going to install a 750, you're not going to want to start off with, let's say, the stock jetting of the 750, which is like 70, 74, or 72, 80, 74, 80. You're going to want to start off with the jetting that your old carburetor had. So chances are, after you install the jetting from your old carburetor, your engine's probably going to run lean, unless it never required that much air in the first place and your carburetor was too big to begin with, in which case the 750 isn't going to do anything and your carburetor is probably going to run the same. If anything, it's just going to feel a little tiny bit sluggish in the low end just because velocity is a little bit slower, but I don't think it's anything you can really feel in the seat of the pants. It's very marginal, the difference that you end up feeling, depending on the power level, obviously. So in order to tune a specific carburetor to your application, like I mentioned before, you're going to want to go ahead and tune from bottom to top. You're going to want to get your foundation, your idle, your transition, your main jets squared away 100%. I should have videos for most of that on the channel already. The next thing you're going to want to tune for is your power valve and your secondaries. If you guys don't have a dyno near you or can't afford a dyno near you and you still want to get your carburetor tuned, it's going to take a lot more time and a lot more effort, but you guys can do it. You're going to need to swap out a bunch of different spark plugs as you go along, but definitely doable. People have been doing this for 50 plus years, tuning their carburetors using spark plugs and their timing and everything, getting that all squared away. I'll have more videos on this in the near future, but for the most part, every engine is different and you're going to want to tune according to whatever you already have. So that's it for now. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.